Her billionaire husband stood before 500 of Manhattan's most powerful people and announced that she was worthless. He didn't whisper it in private where only she could hear. He didn't save it for a quiet conversation at home. No, Marcus Devereaux lifted his champagne glass in a ballroom dripping with crystal chandeliers and old money, and he announced to everyone that his wife, the woman he had promised to love and cherish, had never belonged in his world. He said she wasn't on his level. Intellectually, socially, professionally. He said their marriage was a mistake he was finally correcting. The crowd gasped. Then they whispered. Then someone actually laughed. His mother, Celestine, raised her champagne glass in a toast to new beginnings. His business partners nodded approvingly, like he'd just announced a brilliant merger rather than the public execution of his wife's dignity. And Vivian? She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She didn't beg for an explanation that would never come. She simply set down her champagne glass, smoothed the front of her midnight blue gown, and walked out in complete silence. The room watched her go, some with pity, some with amusement, all of them certain they were witnessing the quiet exit of a woman who had been put firmly in her place. But here's what no one in that room knew. By the time the sun rose the next morning, the headlines would speak her name in a way that would make Marcus Devereaux's blood run cold. The empire he thought he'd built would begin to crumble before breakfast, and the woman he'd called worthless would be revealed as one of the most powerful media figures in the entire country. Now I need to ask you something. Have you ever been dismissed by someone who was supposed to love you? Have you ever stayed silent while someone tore you apart in front of others, not because you had nothing to say, but because you knew your silence would be louder than any scream? Vivian Ashworth spent 6 years shrinking herself to fit into her husband's shadow. She dimmed her light. She buried her power. She became a ghost in her own life. And Marcus Devereaux? He had no idea who he was married to. No idea that the quiet woman he called ordinary was actually one of the most influential voices in American journalism. No idea that while he was busy dismissing her worth, she was carrying a weapon that could destroy everything he'd ever built. What happens when a woman who has been hiding finally decides to step into the light? What happens when the person everyone underestimated reveals exactly who they really are? Marcus Devereaux was about to find out, and by the time he understood what he'd lost, it would be far too late. This is the story of a woman who turned her silence into a symphony of destruction. And trust me, you don't want to miss a single note. Hello, my beautiful family. Welcome back to Mr. Andy Love Stories. If you're new here, let me tell you what this channel is about. This is your home for stories that will grip your heart, challenge your spirit, and remind you that the quietest people often carry the loudest power. Every story I share has a purpose: to uplift you, to inspire you, and to show you that no matter how invisible you feel, there is always a way back to yourself. Before we begin today's journey, I want to speak a blessing over everyone watching. May every woman who has ever been told she wasn't enough discover the fire that burns within her. May every person who has dimmed their light for someone else find the courage to shine again. May you find strength in your silence and power in your truth. You are not invisible. You are not ordinary. You are extraordinary, and anyone who can't see that is simply not worthy of your light. Now, my family, I need your help with something. This channel is fighting to reach the people who need these stories most. YouTube only shows our videos to new viewers when you engage with the content. So right now, before we go any further, I'm asking you to do 3 simple things. First, hit that subscribe button and tap the notification bell so you never miss a story. Second, drop a like on this video. And third, leave a comment telling me, have you ever been underestimated? Have you ever stayed silent when you had the power to speak? I read every single comment, and your stories inspire me to keep creating. Now, let me take you back to the beginning. To understand what happened at that gala, you first need to understand who Vivian Ashworth really was, the woman hiding behind the quiet smile. And trust me, what I'm about to tell you will change everything. The world knew her as V. Sterling. That name had appeared on investigative reports that toppled corrupt politicians, exposed corporate fraud, and changed legislation across the country. V. Sterling's byline commanded respect and fear. In equal measure, when powerful people saw that name attached to an investigation, they hired crisis management teams and started deleting evidence. The Meridian Chronicle, the platform Fars Sterling had built from nothing, had grown into one of the most influential investigative journalism outlets in America. 10 million monthly readers, a staff of dedicated journalists who believed in the mission, Stories that had sent CEOs to prison and forced pharmaceutical companies to recall dangerous drugs. But nobody, not the journalists who worked for her, not the politicians who feared her, not the public who consumed her work, knew the truth. V. Sterling was Vivian Ashworth, and Vivian Ashworth was living a double life that would have seemed impossible to anyone who knew either version of her. By day, she was the quiet wife of billionaire Marcus Devereaux. She attended charity functions in designer gowns. She smiled for photographs. She said very little and attracted even less attention. The elite circles she moved through saw her as decorative at best, forgettable at worst, just another trophy wife with nothing to contribute beyond her presence. By night, she was the founder and anonymous owner of a media empire worth $340 million. She reviewed investigations, approved publications, and guided her team through stories that would change lives and end careers. The contrast was staggering, and it was entirely by design. Listen carefully because this is important. Vivian had learned early in her career that real power came from seeing without being seen. She had built the Chronicle from a tiny apartment in Queens, working on a second-hand laptop while eating ramen noodles and dreaming of something bigger. She had been 22 years old, grieving her mother's death, with nothing to her name except a collection of worn notebooks and an unshakable belief that truth mattered. Her mother had been a journalist at a small-town newspaper in Vermont. Not famous, not wealthy, but passionate in a way that made every story feel like a mission. She had taught Vivian that the most important stories were the ones nobody wanted told, that real journalism meant giving voice to the voiceless, that truth was worth fighting for even when the fight seemed impossible. When cancer took her mother in Vivian's senior year of college, she inherited nothing but those beliefs and a collection of notes about stories her mother had never finished. Vivian finished them. That first year after her mother's death, she worked 3 jobs to pay rent while building the Chronicle in every spare moment she could find. She wrote under a pseudonym because she was nobody, no credentials, no connections, no resources, and she knew that nobody would take a 22-year-old seriously. But V. Sterling? That name had no face, no age, no gender anyone could confirm. That name was just truth, delivered without compromise. The breakthrough came 18 months in. Vivian had spent 6 months investigating a pharmaceutical company that was hiding data about dangerous side effects in a popular heart medication. The story was airtight. The evidence was devastating. And when she published it, the response was immediate. The article went viral. Regulators launched investigations. The CEO resigned in disgrace. Families who had lost loved ones to that medication finally had answers. And V. Sterling became a name that powerful people learned to fear. More investigations followed, more exposés, more accountability. The Chronicle grew from a one-woman operation to a team of dedicated journalists who shared Vivian's mission. The money followed. Donations, subscriptions, partnerships with outlets that wanted to co-publish her work. By her 30th birthday, Vivian was worth over $300 million. Her platform had changed laws, ended careers, and saved lives. But nobody knew her face. Nobody knew her name. And that was exactly how she wanted it. The anonymity was protection. Powerful people had tried to find Fifth Sterling for years. They'd hired investigators. They'd threatened lawsuits. They'd done everything in their power to unmask the person who kept exposing their secrets. Vivian had stayed invisible, safe, untouchable. But invisibility came with a cost she hadn't anticipated. She was lonely, profoundly, achingly lonely. She had built an empire, but she had no one to share it with. She had power, but she couldn't tell anyone about it. She was one of the most influential people in journalism, but at parties and social events, people looked right through her like she was glass. The isolation wore on her, the exhaustion of maintaining 2 identities, the weight of secrets that had to be kept from everyone, always. She found herself wanting just once to be seen as herself, not as V. Sterling, the threat that made powerful people tremble, not as a pseudonym that commanded respect, just as Vivian, just as a woman who wanted to be loved for who she actually was. That vulnerability, that desperate human need for connection, was the crack in her armor. And Marcus Devereaux walked right through it. The coffee shop in Brooklyn was exactly the kind of place Vivian loved. Nothing fancy, nothing pretentious, just good coffee, worn wooden tables, and the comfortable anonymity of a neighborhood spot where nobody cared who you were or what you did. She had a ritual when the pressure of her double life became too much. She would dress down, a second-hand cardigan, glasses she didn't need, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she would find a coffee shop where she could just be. Not Fifth Sterling, not anyone important, just a woman with a laptop and a cup of tea gone cold. On this particular Tuesday afternoon, she was working on an article about education policy, something lighter than her usual investigations. The coffee shop was quiet. The barista knew her order. Everything felt normal. Then Marcus Devereaux walked in. He moved through the door like he owned the entire block, which, as Vivian would later learn, he nearly did. His family's real estate holdings included half of Brooklyn. He was handsome in that sharp, dangerous way that wealthy men often were. All confidence and tailored clothing and the easy charm of someone who had never been told no. Vivian noticed him immediately, not because she was attracted to him, but because she was a journalist. She noticed everything. She noticed how he ordered something complicated and specific. She noticed how the barista, a young woman who was clearly new and nervous, got it wrong. And she noticed how his expression shifted from charming to cold in a heartbeat. "I said almond milk, not oat milk," he snapped. "Is that really so difficult to understand? It's your one job." The barista's face crumbled. She apologized, started making the drink again, hands shaking. Vivian's jaw tightened. She knew this type, the kind of man who treated service workers like they were beneath basic respect, the kind of man who showed you exactly who he was in small moments when he thought nobody important was watching. But then Marcus noticed Vivian watching him. Something shifted in his expression. He looked at the barista, then back at Vivian, and seemed to recalculate something. "I'm sorry," he said to the barista, loud enough for Vivian to hear. "That was uncalled for. Long day. Not your fault." He paid for his coffee, left a generous tip, and then he walked over to Vivian's table. "I'm mortified that you witnessed that," he said, flashing a smile that probably worked on most people. "I'm not usually that person. Can I buy you a coffee to make up for subjecting you to my worst self?" Every instinct Vivian had developed over years of investigating powerful people told her to say no. The apology was performative. The charm was practiced. This man had shown her exactly who he was in that moment with the barista, and no amount of recovery could erase it. But Vivian was tired, so tired of being invisible, so tired of being alone. And here was someone who was looking at her, really looking at her like she was worth seeing. She said yes. Their first coffee lasted 3 hours. Marcus was charming when he wanted to be, which was most of the time. He asked questions about her life, though Vivian noticed he didn't listen very carefully to the answers before steering the conversation back to himself. She told him she was a freelance writer. He nodded without interest, already moving on to topics he found more important: his business ventures, his philanthropic initiatives, his vision for changing the world through real estate development. Vivian told herself his self-absorption was just confidence. She told herself his dismissal of her work was just ignorance about the writing world. She told herself the warning signs she'd seen were just stress, just a bad day, just temporary. She ignored every red flag because she was lonely, because she wanted this to be real, because she was so tired of being invisible that she would accept being seen poorly rather than not being seen at all. Their first date became a second, then a third, then weekends at his family's estate in Connecticut. Marcus pursued her with an intensity that felt like devotion. He seemed charmed by her simplicity, her worn cardigans, her quiet demeanor, her apparent lack of ambition beyond her little writing projects. What Vivian didn't realize was that Marcus wasn't attracted to her. He was attracted to the idea of her. He wanted a wife who would make him look good without outshining him. He wanted someone simple and unassuming who would orbit his brilliance without ever demanding center stage. He wanted a trophy who would be grateful for his attention and never question his authority. Vivian, hiding her true self behind that worn cardigan, seemed perfect. The proposal came 4 months in, far too fast for a healthy relationship, but Vivian was too deep in the fantasy to notice. He surprised her with a weekend trip to Paris, a private dinner at the top of the Eiffel Tower, and a ring that cost more than most people's houses. She said yes, because she wanted to believe, because she was tired of being alone, because she thought love could change him, could soften his edges, could make him see her for who she truly was. The wedding was a Devereaux production. 500 guests, most of whom Vivian had never met. Her mother's absence felt like a physical wound. She wore a gown Celestine had chosen, stood in a venue Celestine had selected, and followed a schedule Celestine had created. She felt like a prop in someone else's story. But she told herself it was just the wedding. The marriage would be different. The marriage would be real. She was wrong about everything. My beautiful family. We're about to enter the darkest part of Vivian's story. The part where the man she loved begins to systematically erase who she is. The part where the woman who built an empire from nothing is convinced that she is worth nothing at all. Before we continue, I need to know you're with me. If you've ever been in a relationship where someone made you feel less than, where someone convinced you that shrinking yourself was the same as loving them, I want you to type "I understand" in the comments below. Because you are not alone. Vivian's story is about to show you that there is always a way back to yourself. If this story is already gripping you, hit that like button right now. The algorithm watches those early likes, and every tap helps more people find this story who need to hear it. Also, share this video with someone who might be going through something similar. Sometimes the story someone else tells is the one that helps us understand our own. Now let me show you exactly how Marcus Devereaux began to destroy the woman he called his wife. The erosion began with whispers disguised as suggestions. "You don't need to work, darling. My money is our money now. That dress is a bit ambitious for someone with your figure, don't you think? I'd appreciate it if you let me do the talking at dinner. These are important people, and you don't really have anything to contribute to the conversation." Each comment alone seemed minor. A preference, a suggestion, something that could be explained away as concern or practicality. But comments accumulate. They scar. They reshape the landscape of who you are. Vivian found herself adjusting, accommodating, making herself smaller to fit the space Marcus had allotted for her existence. The first time she canceled an editorial meeting to attend one of his events, she told herself it was a reasonable compromise. Marriage required sacrifice. The first time she changed her outfit because he disapproved, she told herself it was easier than arguing. The first time she stayed silent when she had something valuable to say, she told herself it wasn't worth the conflict. Each concession seemed small. Together, they were devastating. Celestine made everything worse. Marcus's mother was a master of elegant cruelty, the kind of woman who could destroy you with a smile, who wrapped her insults in compliments so perfectly that you couldn't quite name what she'd done until hours later when the words finally sank in. She appeared at their home uninvited, criticized Vivian's housekeeping despite the staff, and constantly reminded Marcus that he had married beneath him. "She's lovely, I suppose," Celestine would say, loud enough for Vivian to hear, in that common sort of way. "But honestly, Marcus, what will you talk about when the novelty wears off? She reads those dreadful news sites all day. Has she any accomplishments of her own?" The irony burned like acid. Vivian wanted to scream. She wanted to say, "I am V. Sterling. I brought down a corrupt senator last month. My platform has 10 million readers. I have accomplished more in my lifetime than you and your son combined." But she said nothing. She smiled. She swallowed the words like poison, letting them corrode her from the inside. Because revealing herself meant destroying the marriage. And destroying the marriage meant admitting she'd been wrong about everything. As the months passed, Vivian began to lose herself. The Chronicles suffered first. She started missing meetings, relying entirely on encrypted communications with her business partner, Benedict Howell. Benedict had managed the Chronicles operations since the early days, and he knew her better than anyone. He was the brother she'd chosen rather than born to, and he was increasingly worried. "Viv, you haven't written anything in months," he said during one of their encrypted calls. "You barely engage with editorial decisions. The woman I know would never have let that healthcare expose go to print without reviewing it herself." "I trust the team," Vivian said weakly. "That's not the point. The point is that you're disappearing. I can hear it in your voice. You're becoming someone else." She ended the call without responding, because she knew Benedict was right. She knew she was drowning, but she didn't know how to stop. She looked in the mirror and didn't recognize the woman staring back. Straightened hair, because Marcus said he preferred it that way. Clothes chosen for his approval rather than her comfort. A smile that never reached her eyes. The woman who had built an empire from nothing was being erased, and she was letting it happen because she was too afraid to admit the truth. Then came the story that changed everything. The Chronicle received a tip about Devereaux Holdings, Marcus's company. The source was credible. The allegations were staggering. Illegal land seizures in vulnerable communities. Families displaced from homes they'd lived in for generations. Bribed inspectors who looked the other way while safety regulations were violated. Destroyed evidence. Falsified reports. The human cost was devastating. Children losing schools. Elderly residents losing the only homes they'd ever known. Communities shattered to make way for luxury developments that would house people who would never know or care what had been destroyed. And the trail led directly to Marcus. Vivian reviewed the evidence in her secret office, hands shaking, heart pounding, document after document, photograph after photograph, testimony after testimony. She was married to a monster, not just cruel in private, cruel in public, cruel to strangers, cruel as a business model. His entire empire was built on the suffering of people who had no power to fight back. She should have published immediately. This was exactly the kind of story she had built the Chronicle to tell. This was exactly the kind of injustice she had dedicated her life to exposing. But publishing meant destroying Marcus. It meant destroying her marriage. It meant facing the truth she had been avoiding for years. She called Benedict, barely able to speak through the shaking. "I need to tell you something," she said. "About my husband." She told him everything. About the investigation, about the evidence, about the impossible choice she was facing. Benedict's response was immediate. "Publish. This is who you are, Viv. This is what you built the Chronicle for. But, no buts. You've spent 3 years protecting a man who doesn't deserve protection. You've buried yourself to make him comfortable. And now you have evidence that he's hurting people, real people, innocent people, and you're hesitating?" "I need more time," Vivian whispered. "You've had time. You've had years. What you need is courage." But Vivian wasn't sure she had any courage left. She made the devastating decision to bury the story. She told Benedict to hold the investigation indefinitely. She told herself it was temporary, that she'd publish when the time was right, when she was ready, when she had figured out how to disentangle herself from Marcus's life. But she knew she was lying. The evidence sat in a secure file, growing heavier with every day she ignored it. The faces of the displaced families haunted her dreams. She had become exactly what she spent her career exposing, someone who protected the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable. The guilt ate at her constantly, every time Marcus mentioned a new development project, every time she saw news about communities being displaced, every time she looked in the mirror and saw the hollow woman she had become. She was a ghost in her own life, a shadow of the person she'd once been. But somewhere deep inside, deeper than the guilt, deeper than the shame, deeper than the exhaustion of living a lie, a small flame still flickered, waiting for oxygen, waiting to ignite. The morning of the Hartwell Foundation Gala, Vivian woke with a strange sense of unease she couldn't name. This was Marcus's night, the biggest event of the year, the unveiling of his new philanthropic initiative, a project that would cement his reputation as a visionary who cared about more than profit. The irony wasn't lost on Vivian. She knew exactly where his money came from. She knew exactly what that philanthropy was designed to hide. But she said nothing. She dressed carefully in the midnight blue gown Marcus had approved weeks earlier. She straightened her hair the way he preferred. She wore the diamonds he'd given her for their anniversary. She practiced her pleasant, vacant smile in the mirror. She looked beautiful. She felt hollow. Something was different about today. There was a current of anticipation in the air that she couldn't quite place. Celestine had called that morning, unusual in itself. "Make sure you don't embarrass him tonight," her mother-in-law said. "This is important," as if Vivian needed reminding, as if she hadn't spent 6 years learning exactly how to disappear into the background of her own life. The Grand Monarch Hotel was everything Marcus loved, glittering, excessive, a monument to wealth and influence. Crystal chandeliers scattered light across walls lined with priceless art. 500 guests in designer gowns and tailored suits circulated through the ballroom, drinking champagne that cost more per bottle than most people's monthly rent. Vivian entered on Marcus's arm, playing her role to perfection. The decorative wife, the silent accessory, the woman who knew her place. But she noticed things. She always noticed things. It was what had made her a great journalist, even if she'd forgotten how to be one. She noticed the whispers that stopped when she walked by. She noticed the sidelong glances with a strange quality she couldn't identify. She noticed Celestine's knowing smile from across the room. Something was coming. Everyone seemed to know except her. When Marcus took the stage for his speech, Vivian felt the first real flutter of dread. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Marcus began, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who had never doubted his own importance. "This evening marks the beginning of a new chapter, a chapter of truth, of authenticity, of living without compromise." Vivian's stomach tightened. Something was wrong. "Many of you know that I've been married for 6 years to a wonderful woman. Her blood ran cold. Vivian has been supportive, present, but I've come to realize that support isn't the same as partnership. Presence isn't the same as contribution. 500 pairs of eyes swiveled toward her. I've made the difficult decision to end my marriage, Marcus continued, his voice never wavering. Vivian is a good woman, but she simply isn't equipped for the life I'm building. She isn't on my level, intellectually, socially, professionally. Continuing this marriage would be unfair to both of us. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Whispers rose and fell like waves. Celestine raised her champagne glass in approval. Marcus's business partners nodded, as if he'd just announced a brilliant strategy. Someone near the back actually laughed. Vivian stood frozen. She watched her husband, the man she had dimmed herself for, sacrificed herself for, hidden from for 6 years, dismiss her worth in front of everyone who mattered. The diamonds around her neck suddenly felt like a noose, and something inside her, something that had been cracking for years, finally shattered. But instead of destroying her, it set her free. Time seemed to slow down. Vivian saw everything with sudden, brutal clarity. Not the man she'd hoped he'd become, the man he'd always been. Every warning sign she'd ignored. Every piece of herself she'd sacrificed. Every truth she'd buried to preserve a marriage that had never been real. The faces of the displaced family she'd failed to protect. The evidence sitting in a secure file. The woman she'd been before Marcus convinced her she was nothing. Something sleeping for 6 years finally woke up. Not with a scream. With absolute clarity. She knew exactly who she was. She knew exactly what she was going to do. Vivian set down her champagne glass. The movement was so unexpected, so contrary to the invisible woman she'd become, that conversations faltered around her. She stood straight, not cowering, not apologizing, not asking permission to exist. She smoothed the front of her midnight blue gown with deliberate care. She met Marcus's eyes across the room, held his gaze for one long, unwavering moment, and then, without a single word, without a tear, without any of the reactions he'd expected, she turned and walked toward the exit. Every step was deliberate, unhurried, dignified. The crowd parted for her like water. She felt their eyes on her back, felt their whispers rising behind her, felt the weight of 500 judgments being formed about the woman Marcus Devereaux had just discarded. Let them judge. Let them whisper. Let them laugh. They had no idea what was coming. Vivian walked through the gilded doors of the Grand Monarch Hotel and into the night air, and for the first time in 6 years she could breathe. My family, pause with me for just a moment. Vivian just walked out of the greatest humiliation of her life without saying a single word. Marcus thinks he's won. Celestine is celebrating. The whole room is laughing at the woman they believe has been put in her place. But remember what I told you at the beginning. Remember who Vivian really is. Remember the weapon she's been carrying all along. What happens next will change everything. And I need to know you're ready for it. If you're on the edge of your seat right now, hit that like button. If you want to see Marcus Devereaux get exactly what he deserves, drop a comment that says Justice IS coming. Let me see those comments flooding in. And if you haven't subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? Hit that button right now. You don't want to miss what happens next. Because the woman who walked out in silence, she's about to speak louder than Marcus Devereaux has ever heard anyone speak in his life. Let's continue. Vivian didn't go home. She went to the Chronicle Secure headquarters in the meatpacking district, a building in a converted warehouse that Marcus didn't even know she owned. As she walked through the empty streets, she stripped away the pieces of the woman she'd been pretending to be. The diamonds came off first, dropped into her purse without ceremony. Then the pins from her straightened hair, letting it spring back toward its natural state. By the time she reached the elevator, she looked like herself again. The real Vivian. The one who had built an empire from nothing. The one who had been hiding for far too long. Benedict was waiting in the office. He'd been watching the Gala live stream. One of the media outlets had been covering the event, capturing every moment of Marcus's speech. His face showed fury, concern, and something that looked like relief all at once. "Viv, I'm so sorry," he began, reaching for her. "I should have warned you. There were rumors, but I didn't think he'd actually—" "Pull up everything," Vivian said, her voice steady as steel. "Everything we have on Devereaux Holdings." Benedict stared at her for a moment. Then he smiled, a fierce, proud smile. "It's about time." They worked through the night. Every document Vivian had buried over the past 3 years was now spread across multiple screens. The illegal land seizures, the bribed inspectors, the destroyed evidence, the falsified safety reports, the families who had lost everything so Marcus could build luxury developments for people who would never know or care. Vivian reviewed every piece of evidence with fierce intensity, the way she had before Marcus convinced her she was worthless. This was who she was. This was what she was built for. She had almost let him destroy it, but almost wasn't the same as succeeding. Benedict coordinated with their legal team, ensuring every claim was bulletproof. Their fact-checkers verified every document. Their lawyers reviewed every sentence. By 4 a.m., the exposé was complete. Vivian wrote the headline herself, the way she always had for the stories that mattered most. Devereaux Holdings exposed, inside the billionaire empire built on displacement, corruption, and fraud, by V. Sterling. But she wasn't done. She wrote a second piece, one she had never imagined writing, one that would change everything about her carefully constructed invisible life. Who is V. Sterling? After a decade in the shadows, the founder of the Meridian Chronicle steps into the light. This piece told her own story. Her mother's death, building the Chronicle from nothing, the decision to remain anonymous, and the marriage that had nearly destroyed her. She included her real name, her photograph, her entire history. No more hiding, no more invisibility, no more letting others define who she was and what she was worth. Are you sure about this? Benedict asked, reading over her shoulder. Once this is out, there's no going back. I've been invisible for too long, Vivian said. It's time the world sees who I am. At 5 a.m., she signed both pieces. At 6 a.m., they went live. By 7 a.m., both stories were trending worldwide. Marcus Devereaux woke that morning to the sound of his phone exploding with notifications. He reached for it groggily, still hungover from the champagne he'd consumed celebrating his masterful handling of the divorce announcement. He expected congratulations, praise for his honesty, maybe some interview requests about his bold new direction. The first headline made his blood run cold. The second stopped his heart entirely. His wife, his quiet, ordinary, worthless wife, was V. Sterling. His wife owned a Meridian Chronicle. His wife had just published an investigative report so thorough, so devastating, that his legal team was already texting about emergency containment strategies. He called her number, disconnected. He called his lawyers. They were fielding calls from federal regulators. He called his mother. She was too busy scrambling to distance the family foundation from his company to answer. By noon, Devereaux Holdings stock had plummeted 40%. By evening, Marcus was facing multiple federal investigations. By the following morning, his own board of directors had demanded his resignation. The media coverage was relentless. Every article connected the exposé to the Gala humiliation, painting a narrative that the public couldn't get enough of. Arrogant billionaire destroyed by the wife he'd publicly called worthless. Marcus tried to fight back. He called reporters claiming Vivian was lying, that she'd been planning this for years, that she was mentally unstable. But every reporter he spoke to asked the same question. Mr. Devereaux, are you aware of who your wife actually is? When they told him about her 3 successful investigations that had changed legislation, her decade of award to winning journalism, her media empire worth hundreds of millions, he realized he had never known her at all. He had only known the version of her he wanted to see. The divorce was swift. Vivian's lawyers contacted Marcus's with a simple offer. She wanted nothing except her freedom. No settlement, no claim on his money, just the dissolution of a marriage that had been built on lies. Marcus, desperate to make the investigations disappear, agreed to everything. On the day the divorce was finalized, Vivian walked out of her lawyer's office into the morning sun. She took off her wedding ring, the enormous diamond that had once seemed like proof of love and now felt like a chain she'd finally broken. She left it on the sidewalk. She didn't look back. The months after the divorce were a revelation. Vivian gave interviews for the first time in her career, revealing herself as V. Sterling to a public that had wondered about the mysterious journalist for years. She spoke about her work, her mission, her belief that truth was the only foundation worth building on. When asked about Marcus, she said simply, "The divorce is finalized. I wish him well." No bitterness, no revenge gloating, just the quiet dignity of a woman who had already moved on. The public response was overwhelming. People saw her as an inspiration, The woman who had risen from the ashes of a devastating public humiliation to reveal herself as more powerful than anyone had imagined. But Vivienne wasn't interested in being a symbol. She was interested in being herself. She sold the apartment she'd shared with Marcus and bought a townhouse in Brooklyn, just blocks from the coffee shop where they'd first met. The irony was intentional. She was reclaiming the place where she'd lost herself. She filled the new space with books and art and colors she'd always loved but had been told were too bold. Her natural hair, wild and free. Clothes she chose for herself. A studio for painting, something she'd always wanted but had never allowed herself. She looked in the mirror and finally recognized the woman staring back. The Chronicle continued to grow. Young journalists sought her mentorship. Universities invited her to speak. Her work continued to expose corruption and amplify truth. But now she did it in the light, not the shadows. Benedict remained her closest friend and partner. He brought her coffee when she worked too late, forced her to take vacations she didn't want, and reminded her constantly that she had survived something most people couldn't imagine. "You saved yourself," he told her one evening, as they sat on her Brooklyn rooftop watching the sunset. "You could have stayed silent. You could have let him keep winning. But you chose truth. You chose yourself." "I almost didn't," Vivienne admitted. "I almost stayed. I almost let him convince me I was nothing. But you didn't. That's what matters." Still, something was missing. The loneliness that had made her vulnerable to Marcus in the first place hadn't entirely disappeared. She had rebuilt her career, her identity, her sense of self. But she hadn't rebuilt her ability to trust. She met Tobias Clement at a bookshop in Park Slope on a quiet Saturday afternoon. She was reaching for an obscure poetry collection, something her mother had loved, when another hand reached for the same book at the same moment. They both apologized simultaneously, which made them both laugh. He was tall, with kind eyes and paint-stained fingers. An artist who taught at a community college and spoke about creativity like it was a form of prayer. "I don't really follow the news," he admitted sheepishly when she asked about his work. "I know that probably makes me a terrible citizen, but I find it all too overwhelming. I'd rather focus on what's beautiful than what's broken." For the first time in her life, Vivienne met someone who had no idea who V. Sterling was. To Tobias, she was just Vivienne. Just a woman in a bookshop who liked the same poetry he did. The simplicity of it, the relief of it, was overwhelming. They started with coffee, then dinner, then long walks through Brooklyn where they talked about everything except the news. He asked about her childhood, her dreams, her fears. He listened, really listened, in ways Marcus never had. On their 6th date, Vivienne told him everything. About Marcus, about hiding her identity, about the years she'd spent shrinking herself to fit someone else's expectations. Tobias listened without interrupting. When she finished, he took her hand. "You're the bravest person I've ever met," he said quietly. "Not because you took down a corrupt billionaire, though that's incredible, but because you chose to be yourself again after someone worked so hard to erase you. That takes more courage than any headline." Vivienne cried for the first time since the gala, not from pain, but from the overwhelming relief of being truly seen. Their love grew slowly, carefully, not the consuming fire that had characterized her relationship with Marcus, a steady warmth that sustained rather than destroyed. When Tobias proposed a year later, he didn't get down on one knee. He asked her face to face, eye to eye. "I'm not asking you to complete me," he said. "You're already whole. I'm whole. But I'm asking if two whole people want to build something extraordinary together." She said yes with tears and laughter, and the absolute certainty that this time she'd chosen right. Their wedding was small. 30 people who actually mattered, gathered in the Brooklyn Botanic Garden on a September afternoon. Vivienne wore a dress she'd chosen herself. Her natural hair framed her face. No diamonds, no pretense, just love. That night, dancing under string lights, Tobias whispered in her ear, "Any regrets?" Vivienne thought about the woman who had walked silently out of the gala. She thought about the headlines that had spoken her name. She thought about all the versions of herself she'd been. The invisible woman, the trophy wife, the phoenix rising from ashes. Only that it took so long, she said. But maybe it had to take that long. Maybe I had to lose myself completely before I could find who I actually wanted to be. She looked at the man who saw her completely, who loved her fire instead of trying to extinguish it, who had never once asked her to be smaller. "Now I finally understand what love is supposed to feel like. It's not hiding, it's not shrinking. It's standing in the light with someone who celebrates every part of you. My beautiful family, Vivian's story teaches us something profound. The people who try to make you invisible often fear how brightly you could shine. Your worth is never determined by someone else's inability to see it. And sometimes, silence is the most powerful statement you can make. But silence isn't the same as acceptance. Vivian walked out of that gala without saying a word, but she let her work speak for her. She let the truth speak for her. And by the time the sun rose, everyone knew exactly who she was. May you find the courage to step out of whatever shadows you've been hiding in. May you speak truth even when it costs you everything. May you remember that you are not invisible. You are simply waiting for the right moment to be seen. And when that moment comes, may you shine so brightly that the people who dismissed you have to shield their eyes. If this story touched your soul, subscribe to Mr. Andy Love Stories and hit that notification bell. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that their silence can become their greatest weapon. And drop a comment telling me, what truth are you ready to speak? What light are you ready to let the world see? Remember, the headlines of your life are still being written. Make sure they speak your name. Until next time, my beautiful family, stay blessed, stay powerful, stay undeniably you. This is Mr. Andy, and I love you all.